Jews have never been a political monolith. Try as many may to assert that all Jews are liberal Democrats, that's just not the case. For much of the late 20th century, the Jewish vote could be counted to swing in presidential elections around 70% for the Democratic candidate. And that was, of course, true still for much of this century. However, a study released by Pew Research in June revealed that 70-30 split had shifted to 63-35 in the most recent presidential election. I was recently speaking with a friend at a large suburban Reform synagogue, and I was shocked when he told me that he and his staff now assume that their membership is majority Republican. They assume somewhere around 60-40. While shifts in the Jewish community are not only happening around politics, it seems to be felt most acutely there because of October 7th, the subsequent war, and the rise in anti-Semitism over the last decade. And I'm positive that even in our congregation, there is more political diversity than many of us might suspect. How do I know? Because over the past year, I've witnessed at least 3 different responses to the ideological tensions pulling at our community. Each represents a different way people handle disagreement, and each has something to teach us. Some time ago, a member reached out after I had taken public positions on issues they felt had no religious connection. This person often votes for Republican candidates and feels their minority voice isn't being heard. They were concerned about the reproductive freedom banner we've displayed outside our building since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We spent considerable time on the phone as I explained my reasoning and grounded it in Torah. And they still didn't love my position, but they understood it better. Most importantly, they said, "I just wish we would stay away from potentially divisive issues." This member represents those who respond to ideological tension by pushing back, by advocating for their perspective while remaining in community. They challenge in the hopes of bringing balance. About a month ago, I sat down with a different member of our congregation for a cup of coffee in what became a profoundly honest conversation. This person had sent me an email with pointed questions about where our temple stands. They wrote, "What is the temple's current perspective on the war? Does it support continued occupation of Gaza? What is the temple's response to the current humanitarian crisis? How does the temple aim to support divergent viewpoints and create a space where all will feel welcome?" Here was someone genuinely seeking to understand the community's stance and my opinions. They weren't attacking, they were questioning. They weren't leaving, they were engaging. This member represents those who respond to disagreement with curiosity rather than condemnation. A few months ago, an anonymous letter arrived in my mailbox, my physical mailbox. A response to something I had written after the presidential election. Knowing that many in our congregation would be upset about the election results, I sent an email with the hope of bringing some comfort. The author identified as a congregation member but felt compelled to conceal their identity. They wrote, "We seem to be part of a group that's reviled because we feel that Trump supports better policies for our country and for Jews here and in Israel than Biden-Harris. We fear retribution from those who see themselves as tolerant." Here was someone so afraid of judgment that they couldn't even sign their name to their own beliefs. This member represents those who respond to disagreement by retreating into isolation, by suffering alone rather than risking community conflict. Each response is understandable. Each reflects a different temperament, a different level of comfort with conflict. And in a healthy Jewish community, we should have room for all people, even as we encourage the isolated member to identify themselves and voice their concerns. The questioner should feel free to probe. The challenger should feel heard, even in minority. And most importantly, the silent sufferer should never have to choose between their convictions and their community. Right now, we're failing that third person. When members of our congregation feel they must write anonymous letters because they fear retribution for their political beliefs, we have work to do. Not because their beliefs are right or wrong, but because fear has no place in sacred community. I believe our congregation should take pride in the fact that we have not had a high number of synagogue resignations in our community due to ideological disagreements. We continue to be a growing congregation. And yet, we have had a few instances in the last year or two. The number may be small, but it still alarms me. I fear for the state of synagogue communities. Interestingly, I've had families tell me that they are leaving the synagogue because they think I'm too supportive of Israel, and others tell me that they're leaving the synagogue because the community is not supportive enough. One person said to me, "I just can't imagine coming to Yom Kippur services and sitting next to an anti-Zionist." All of these encounters represent more than individual stories. They represent, I think, a crisis. When members feel they must choose between their political convictions and their spiritual home, when families leave synagogues over ideological differences, when people write anonymous letters because they fear their own community, we're in danger. We've survived persecution, exile, and attempts at annihilation, where we allow ideological purity to accomplish what our enemies could not: the fracturing of the Jewish community from within. In an era that sees us retreating to ideological silos and echo chambers, we must prevent our congregation from becoming an intellectual prison of agreement. The question is, how do we hold together as a community when we have strong disagreements? And the answer, I believe, lies in remembering who we are. We all know that old humorous quip, and Mark reminded us on Rosh Hashanah about Jews: 2 Jews, 3 opinions. It may be intended to poke at how opinionated we are, but I'd like to hear it in a different way. This line isn't just about Jews being opinionated. Hidden in this joke is the ability to see more than one side of an argument, the ability to hold multiple truths at the same time, the possibility of change. Our history of argument goes back over 2,000 years, and the best kind of arguments, our sages tell us, are machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. The name implies that the argument is more than about being right, about scoring points and getting the best of our intellectual adversary. The sacredness of an argument is in its means, not its end. It is how we argue and why we argue to find a truth that we could not find alone. The archetype for machloket l'shem shamayim, this argument for the sake of heaven in Jewish thought, is the 2 schools of Hillel and Shammai. And in a famous section of the Babylonian Talmud, Eruvin 13b, we're told, for 3 years Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. Ultimately, a divine voice, God's voice, emerged and proclaimed, "Both these and those are the words of the living God." However, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. This, however, is not quite the end of the conversation. The Talmud goes on to ask and answer, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel's words privileged to have the law be established in accordance with their opinion? And it answers, the reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted, and when they taught the law, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai. Moreover, when they formulated their teachings and cited a dispute, they prioritized the statements of Beit Shammai to their own statements, in deference to Beit Shammai. Yes, the Babylonian Talmud proclaims that God sides with Hillel because they were nice. Of course, it wasn't only about being nice. We learn from this material that Hillel's readings were about the community. They considered the community and showed deference to leading voices. They weren't dismissive. They weren't condescending. And they weren't reactionary. They embodied so much of what we've lost today in our discourse as a society. There is a reason they were able to do this, even though the followers of Hillel and Shammai had profound disagreements with each other. They were in community with each other. They knew each other. They married each other. They lived together. They worshiped in the same places, and they appreciated that the other school was striving to understand truth just as they were. 2,000 years ago, Hillel was already showing us what Menschlichkeit means. But there's more. I learned this summer from Micha Goodman, an Israeli public intellectual, another reason Jewish tradition argues that the law follows Beit Hillel. This time from the Jerusalem Talmud, where it adds an additional reason. In Tractate Sukkah, Rabbi Yehuda bar Pazi said, if Beit Hillel was convinced by the words of Beit Shammai, they changed their opinions. Hearing this, I was deeply moved. Hillel is lifted up as the primary source of Jewish law because they were willing to change their minds. They weren't so ideologically locked into their thoughts that they couldn't recognize when they were wrong and make the courageous decision to revise. Their lack of rigidity, the softness with which they came to their positions, was not their downfall. It wasn't their weakness. It was their greatest strength. We are more than our politics. But our country has turned to hatred of the other, not because of some action, but some belief, not for what has been done, but for what has been thought. There are many qualities of the secular American world that have benefited Judaism, but let us ensure that this place, this congregation, does not turn more than we already have toward rigid thinking, toward an inability to talk about hard things. We are more than our opinions. On Erev Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Chelsea provided us with a beautiful framework for thinking about tshuva. She highlighted the ways that God developed in the early chapters of Genesis, regretting having destroyed the entire world through the flood, engaging with Abraham and agreeing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if there were 10 righteous people there, and ultimately retracting the commandment to Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. She showed us that if we can understand the ultimate power in the universe is capable of change, then we too are capable of change. Rabbi Chelsea's internal, interpersonal, and intimate is a profound framework for tshuva, but I'd suggest that it is also an important framework for communities in disagreement. We seek out echo chambers to avoid internal reflection. We silo ourselves to avoid interpersonal relationships with people with whom we disagree. We remove ourselves from the community to avoid the intimate experience of spiritual life together. The way we all change for the better is by getting closer, not retreating from each other. We are more than our disagreements. We are human beings called to sacred argument. So let me speak directly to different voices in our community. To the family who wrote me after I sent an email regarding the most recent election, it was not my intention to make anyone feel ostracized or that they don't have a place in our community. It was my intention to address the feelings of the majority of our congregation that this election might spell disaster for America and American Jews. But that doesn't mean I don't want to hear from you. I understand I may have a bully pulpit, but I do not endeavor to be a bully. Your voice, your ideas can only make us better. Your voice may be in the minority, but Judaism values minority opinion. We've preserved minority opinion. It is how we know Shammai existed at all. To the non-Zionists and those questioning Zionism, you belong here. This is just as much your synagogue as anyone else's. I may disagree with you. Much of the congregation might disagree with you as well. But your voice is important. Your voice is still a Jewish voice. There must not be a political litmus test for membership in our community. Tonight we still stand within the threshold of this new year. And as we all know, Shana means year in Hebrew. But like many words, it has more than one meaning. The root Shin, Nun, Hey also explicitly means change. When we say Shana Tova, it is a hope for a good change. But that's not all it means either. In Rabbinic Hebrew, the same root, Shana, can mean study and learning. It is through study and learning that good change comes. Engaging in learning, moving out of our echo chambers, getting uncomfortable and growing from that experience is all bound up in Shana Tova. I'm seeking partners tonight. Partners from our congregation to gather and think about how we might address any growing polarization in our community, both in Ann Arbor and in our congregation. I'm looking for partners who don't think they have all the answers, who are interested in learning and growing, and who want to help the congregation do the same. I'm looking for partners who can help me think about how we might address the changes unfolding in the Jewish world, in our Jewish community. Not to convince anyone that we have the right position, but to encourage us all to keep growing in our positions. We'll start by simply listening to each other, creating space for marginalized voices within this community. We'll look for programs and speakers to bring here as we endeavor to build a more pluralistic community. A community that is the heir of Hillel and Shammai. I'm not asking you to abandon your convictions. I'm asking you to expand your curiosity. Join me in creating a sacred space where we can disagree and still pray together, debate and still break bread together. After Yom Kippur, you'll receive an email asking if you'd like to gather with me to design a path forward, ensuring that all voices interested in pluralism and Jewish values are welcomed in our community. The email will arrive next week, but the choice arrives tonight. Will you choose the comfort of agreement or the growth that comes from sacred disagreement? Will you help build not just a synagogue, but a sanctuary where all Jewish voices are heard, challenged, and valued? In this time of sacred renewal, let us begin by opening our hearts to each other, especially to those with whom we disagree. Because in the end, we are more than our politics, more than our opinions, more than our disagreements. We are human beings, created in God's image, called to sacred argument, bound together in sacred community. Shana Tova. May this year bring good change through sacred learning together.